Good morning. All right, today we're going to go over some vocabulary about some genetics. This is in preparation to get you guys ready to do some genetics problems that I want to work with you on tomorrow after you take your quiz. So, all right, so the title of this is going to be Monohybrid Crosses. Sometimes they're called Punnett squares. A Punnett square is just the scientific name of a Punnett square is monohybrid cross. You're going to hear them called the same thing. Monohybrid just means one. Hybrid means a blend. Kind of like hybrid cars use a blend of gasoline and electricity to run. And then it's crossing two individuals. So mono, one, hybrid, blend, cross, two individuals. So in this case, we're looking at one trait being crossed between two individuals, like hair color or eye color or blood type or something like that. Because we are not making an exact copy like we do in asexual reproduction, you're only going to use a Punnett square when you have organisms that go through sexual reproduction. Otherwise, there's no point in doing a Punnett square because if you're doing it with an asexual organism, it's going to make an exact copy of itself, so you wouldn't need to go through all of this. Okay, so here, this is going to be really heavy on vocabulary. The first set of vocabulary is genotype versus phenotype. The first part is the genotype. This is the set of alleles that an individual has. We call it a set because you get one allele from mom and one allele from dad. And remember, an allele is a version of a trait. So this is not going to tell you what you're going to look like. It's just going to simply tell you what genes you have. You may or may not show those genes. So I've given you an example there, 2 capital R's or 2 lowercase r's. Second word there is phenotype. This is what you actually end up looking like. So genotype is the set of alleles, phenotype is what you look like. So your phenotype is based off of your genotype. What does your genotype code for you to look like? It might code for you to have straight hair. It might code for you to have curly hair. Your phenotype, however, is not going to tell you what genes you have to pass on, though, entirely. Okay, your next set of definitions is dominant versus recessive. We talked a little bit about these on the Gregor Mendel and inheritance worksheets that you guys did. The dominant trait, when we talk about a dominant allele or a dominant trait, you're talking about the trait that is always going to be expressed in your phenotype if you have one copy. You only need one copy. So you might have both copies, you might just have one, but as long as you have one copy, you're going to show that particular phenotype, whatever it codes for. So there's 2 different combinations of genotypes that you can have. You can have 2 dominant alleles, meaning you got both dominant alleles from your parents. Or you can have one dominant allele and one recessive allele, meaning you got one dominant allele from maybe mom and the recessive allele from dad. In this case, if we're going to talk about brown eyes versus blue eyes, brown eyes are dominant, meaning they're more common. If you have one brown-eyed allele, you're going to have brown eyes. This is why brown-eyed parents can sometimes have a blue-eyed child. If both parents are the second type right here, with one dominant and one recessive allele, as long as they both pass on that recessive allele, their kid could have blue eyes. It just depends on whether or not they're a carrier of the blue-eyed allele. The recessive trait, on the other hand, is the trait that's usually masked by the dominant trait if it's there. So in order for you to show the recessive allele, you have to have both copies. You have to have both recessive alleles. So in humans here with this example, blue eyes is recessive, so you have to have a little b and a little b. You would have had to have gotten both of those from your parents. The next set, these 3 words you're probably going to have to come back and visit a lot when we're doing the genetics problems until you just have them memorized. It takes some people a while. So homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and heterozygous. These all describe your genotypes. So the set of alleles you have, not what you look like. That would be the phenotype if it's what you look like. So with your genotype, you can be a homozygous dominant. These words should look familiar too, because we went over these with your Mendel inheritance also. You're a homozygous dominant. Homozygous means the same. Dominant means you have the dominant allele. So you have both or the same dominant alleles. So in this case, it's two capital R's. You could also be homozygous recessive. Homozygous the same. Recessive meaning you carry the recessive alleles. So you would have both recessive alleles or both lowercase alleles. If you don't have very good handwriting, this is a unit that you need to be very careful with because the capital letter and the lowercase letter mean something different. So you want to make sure that when you're doing these Punnett squares, you're very careful with how you're writing your letters. You need to make sure that they're capital or lowercase depending on what the problem has asked for you. Heterozygous is the third genotype. It's the third combination where you would have one dominant and one recessive allele. So you'd have one capital and one lowercase. Heterozygous means both. So again, all three of these describe your genotype. Another thing I'm going to ask you to do in your genetics problems is I'm going to ask you to solve for the different ratios. Sometimes they're called frequencies. This is actually kind of an old term though. So my guess is you're not going to hear about this term very frequently. You're probably just going to hear genotypic and phenotypic ratios, but I stuck them in there just in case. With your genotypic ratio, it looks like a long one, but it's really quite short. It's just 3 numbers. The first number is going to be the number of individuals, and we're talking about the offspring. How many of the offspring are going to be homozygous dominant? How many of them are going to have both capital letters? The second number is how many of them are heterozygous, or how many of them have one dominant allele, and how many have one recessive allele. And again, remember, we're talking about the offspring, not the parents. Third number is going to be the number of homozygous recessive offspring there are. How many offspring have both recessive alleles? Even if a number is 0, you still have to put it in there. Because if you just have a 2-to-2 ratio, I don't know if is that 2 homozygous dominant to 2 heterozygous, and then no homozygous recessive? Is it 2 heterozygous, 2 homozygous recessive, and no homozygous dominant? So you need to, if you have a 0 in these ratios, you have to put them in as a placeholder. We'll talk about that when we do the problems tomorrow, but just keep that in your brain. The last word that I want you to have written down for today is the phenotypic ratio, and that is how many of the offspring are going to have that dominant phenotype. How many of them might have brown eyes versus how many of them would have the recessive phenotype, which would be blue eyes. So that one's just 2 numbers. So, like I said, this slide and this slide are probably going to be the 2 that you're going to have to revisit a lot while we're doing genetics problems until you get the hang of these vocabulary words, which for some people is a little while. So tomorrow after your quiz, we will practice some genetics problems using this vocabulary. So even if you're not quite 100% confident on what these mean, that's okay. We're going to use them and put them into context tomorrow after that quiz. So as long as you have the vocabulary written down, you'll be fine for tomorrow. Don't forget to study for your quiz tomorrow. It's not a test, it's a quiz. It's going to be over cells, organelles, their functions, what they do, where they're located in the cell, and then microscope parts and what they do. You're going to need to know that classification of life, so things like who was Linnaeus, the differences between the mammals and the fishes and the amphibians, things like that. And then you'll also have a little bit on Gregor Mendel and his pea plants. So, what's the scientific name of the pea plant? Why did pea plants make good? Test subjects. These are all things that we did in the pea plant ad. So this shouldn't be too difficult in terms of the new stuff on there. But you probably want to go back and look at the organelles. It's been a while since we've done those. So, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll try to check my mail later on today. I will be online tonight at 7 o'clock. So if you do have any questions, just log on. And then I will be here tomorrow morning, Friday morning, at about 7:15. So if you want to study for your quiz tomorrow morning, I'll be in during that time as well. So next step is to log on to Socrative and work on your assignment.